President Lyndon Johnson inherited a commitment to the survival of anti-communism in South Vietnam, a commitment that he fully agreed with. It's often overlooked today, but Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy and those on the political left, not nearly as left as the Vietnam War would make, especially the Democratic Party, they were in the post-World War period, they were the vehemently anti-communist. And Lyndon Johnson personified that in his travels to Vietnam as vice president. He developed a tight relationship with many Vietnamese leaders, and he would bring that idea and that scope to the presidency with the death of President Kennedy in 1963. But the United States was already deeply involved in Vietnam, if not just trainers and advisors to the South Vietnamese government. In fact, beginning in 1961 through 1963, the United States had been training air crews to engage in combat against the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, and anybody else, communists that were infiltrating South Vietnam. It was called codename Farmgate. With the codename Farmgate, combat crews trained South Vietnamese pilots. The rule was that every mission had to have a South Vietnamese participant in it. Americans couldn't fly solo combat missions against the Viet Cong, and so the Republic of Vietnam had to provide people. And in fact, there are many stories of pilots who have their attack craft ready. They're ready to take off, and as you can see, and especially the T-28 Trojan, you have a pilot and you have a rear observer. Well, they would grab just a South Vietnamese airman off of the airbase who's just happens to be standing around, throw him in the back so that there would be a South Vietnamese person along with them in case they were shot down, to meet the technicalities. And that's part of the Vietnam War. One of my favorite books on the Vietnam War is put out by Regnery Press. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Vietnam. And one of the references they make to the Vietnam War is the war that we weren't allowed to win. It's not a war that we lost, it's a war that we weren't allowed to win. And it's stupid rules like you have to have a South Vietnamese person along with the American personnel. And so as early as the 61, American pilots had been flying combat missions. They just had other South Vietnamese people in the craft with them. But by 1963 and the death of John F. Kennedy, and as you can see, Farmgate is going to fly missions from January of 62 through January of 65. But it would be LBJ that then takes the war to the next level. And one of the reasons that we won't win this conflict is that the American personnel have their hands tied by rules and regulations coming from Washington, especially from the office of the president. Lyndon Johnson would, many instances that he would have his top military advisors come in and he would choose the bombing targets for the next day or the next week. Micromanagement of a war from thousands of miles away. And so Operation Farmgate is the beginning of that. Lyndon Johnson's advisors supported increasing America's involvement in Vietnam. And so at the death of Kennedy, there was a commitment to Vietnam that Lyndon Johnson fully supports. He supports not only the mission in Vietnam, he supports the containment doctrine in general. He supports the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, and the domino theory. In fact, many times he stated if South Vietnam fell, then all of Asia would fall and the west coast of the United States would be next. And so Lyndon Johnson was firmly committed to continued intervention. He personally believed that Vietnam was a test of American resolve, whether the United States could and would stand up to communism. And he was determined as president not to fail. And so during his first months in office, the end of November 1963 into December of 1963, he would expand America's involvement in Vietnam only slightly, sending another 5,000 military advisors to Vietnam, and then had another 5,000 scheduled to go to Vietnam. So a gradual increase of American commitment. But it would be in August of 1964, that Lyndon Johnson got his reason to act, reason to escalate the conflict. On August 2nd, 1964, as far as we know what happened, there are conflicting reports, but this picture seems to confirm at least the first part of the story. On August 2nd, 1964, 3 North Vietnamese gunboats would attack the USS Maddox, a destroyer operating off the coast of North Vietnam in international waters. They'd be attacked by the North Vietnamese patrol boats, torpedo boats, and the Maddox would respond, damaging those patrol boats. And then according to the story, on August the 4th, 3 more Vietnamese gunboats attacked the USS Turner Joy. Now, there is some question, especially about the second attack on August 4th, whether it even happened. The Turner Joy fired rounds. It fought against something, but even as the battle was taking place and radio transcripts are being kept in the Philippines, you read over them, and by all appearances, the Turner Joy was shooting at radar phantoms, not real gunboats. But either way, whether there were real gunboats in the second attack, there certainly had been something in the first attack. Whether the Maddox was in international waters or whether it was in North Vietnamese waters is a matter of question. Whether the Maddox was engaged in spying on North Vietnam and gathering illegal data, that's yet another question. Whether the North Vietnamese came into international waters to attack the Maddox, whether they actually fired on the Maddox, all of those are questions that, are argued and debated, but in the final resolution, and the final playing out of events, Lyndon Johnson uses this attack of August the 2nd, 1964, to go to Congress and ask for authority to expand America's commitment in Vietnam. Congress would vote in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August 7th, 1964. So just days after Johnson's request, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president, and I quote, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, end quote. Now, Secretary of State John Kerry, a few years ago when he was running for president, would mislabel this, and he would insist that when Congress had given support to President George W. Bush to go into Iraq, he said, it's not like Vietnam in which we gave the president a rubber check. Well, the problem with that is a rubber check is one that there's no money to cover and it bounces, which is probably the case these days, but he meant to say a blank check, and that's exactly what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was. It was a blank check to the president to do whatever the president needed to win the war in South Vietnam without further consultation of Congress. This is eternally a bad principle. The legislature is giving up power to the chief executive, and in the words of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his book, The Imperial Presidency, this is the reason why the presidency has become so powerful and has broken out of its constitutional confinement, is because the legislature finds it convenient to give the president power. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes the Senate by a vote of 88-2 and by the House of Representatives by 416-0. So back to the question I originally asked you in the previous video, who was at fault in Vietnam? Was it Truman? Was it Eisenhower? Was it Johnson? Was it Nixon? Or is it the American people? They support this action. As American troops begin to build up in Vietnam, still Johnson insists that these are advisors, that there will be no American boys doing what Asian boys must do for themselves. His words. But that changes on February 7th, 1965, when the Viet Cong launch an attack on Camp Holloway. Camp Holloway was a military base, a U.S. military base near the air base at Pleiku. And at Camp Holloway, 9 U.S. Marines were killed in the attack. And you see on the map where Pleiku is in relation to the 17th parallel. It's right at the end of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the terminus of the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. So it was a convenient spot for a NVA or Viet Cong attack on American forces. In country at the time were the top 3 people that Lyndon Johnson relied on for his decisions. The first to be the commanding general in the theater, General William Westmoreland. Also present was McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and former general and U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, Maxwell Taylor. All 3 of these men had been extremely close to President Kennedy and would become fairly close to Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson relied on them. They rushed to Pleiku, observed the scene, and they called upon the president, telling Johnson that what he needed to do was launch a punitive strike against North Vietnamese targets, specifically against Viet Cong targets operating in South Vietnam. The result was the authorization of Operation Flaming Dart. Flaming Dart, authorized February 13th, 1965, is a series of retaliatory bombings in North Vietnam, attempting to destroy depots and ammunition dumps used to supply the Viet Cong, as well as destroy transportation lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that's going to become a story throughout the Vietnam War. In fact, just to follow that thread, Operation Flaming Dart is going to last until 1965, when Flaming Dart is replaced by the much larger commitment, Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was the attempt to target key installations, strategic points, supply depots, rendezvous points throughout North Vietnam without hitting civilian population centers. Despite the propaganda to the contrary, despite what is cool and sexy by the left today to say Vietnam was a war against the North Vietnamese populace, the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and any Army aircraft engaged in combat in North Vietnam specifically and purposefully avoided attacking population centers. Now, as you can see, the string of bombs being dropped from the B-52, this was called carpet bombing. Were there innocent civilians killed? Absolutely. This is a war, though, to destroy the infrastructure of the North and bring them to the peace tables. The North at any point could have agreed to the separation of the South and could have invited the United States to the peace tables. They simply didn't want to. Why? Because we now know Communist China and Communist Soviet Union were in neck deep in the Vietnam conflict. What student protests in the day will say, why Vietnam? Why are we picking on poor little Vietnam? Why are we involved in this deadly conflict? Well, now we know. This was where the Soviet Union, where Communist China chose to break containment. They chose to embarrass the United States and break free and expand communism throughout Asia. Operation Rolling Thunder, and as you can see from March 65 through November 68, is a wholesale bombing campaign on North Vietnam. Now it comes to an end in 68, hoping to bring the North Vietnamese and the Chinese to the negotiation tables. When they refuse, later President Nixon will put the pressure back on with targeted bombings not only of North Vietnam but of the capital of North Vietnam, Hanoi specifically. And so in two operations, Operation Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2, and I've put Navy personnel, the Navy A-6 intruders there. I've put Air Force planes and of course the B-52. All of these attack aircraft are engaged in bombing campaigns in North Vietnam to accomplish those strategic objectives. The same things that we did in World War II, in Europe, in Japan, in Asia. Same thing that we began doing even at the end of World War I. And so Operation Rolling Thunder would give way to Operation Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. The objectives of all of these air campaigns would be to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail and to destroy North Vietnamese infrastructure. Did it work? Well, certainly it hampered supply routes. It hampered getting relief efforts to the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh and the NLF in South Vietnam, but it's kind of hard to destroy a mountain trail, especially when once you crater the mountain trail, they simply divert around it. Whereas in a modern nation, bombing a road would necessitate the repair of the road or the building of a new one. When you're operating with pack mules and or bicycles, all terrain can then become your trail. And so that becomes problematic for eliminating the supplies reaching the South. After the attacks on Camp Hollowell, in March of 1965, Lyndon Johnson would authorize the landing of 2 battalions of Marines at Da Nang. And Lyndon Johnson still insisted that the United States was not getting into a ground war in Southeast Asia, even though there would soon be more than 100,000 American troops in Vietnam. That would change by July of 1965 when Johnson announced that the U.S. would be taking a more active role. This is called Americanization of the war. And part of that was the ending of the Strategic Hamlet program. and the beginning of relocation programs, and this would continue throughout the war. The strategic hamlet program was very much the same concept that we talked about with the Spanish in Cuba so many videos ago. Then it was called reconcentrados, but the idea is taking loyal population that can be manipulated by the Viet Cong, move them into a prepared village. Here you see one of the villages from the air. It has concentric defenses around it to keep the Viet Cong from infiltrating, and then entrance and exit is highly controlled. Simple fact is the strategic hamlet program failed, and it failed miserably. The same reasons that it failed are the same reasons the reconcentrados failed. These poor Vietnamese peasants have to replant crops. Well, it's hard to grow rice when you've built the village in a location that's not near your rice paddies. So then you have to feed the populace. You have to provide them all their medicines. And so Operation Sunrise, as it was known, the Strategic Hamlet Program, was discontinued in '63, although it was continued in different formats throughout the war. Another part of Americanizing the war was the attempt to eliminate the jungle. Operation Ranch Hand saw the wholesale use of defoliants from 1962 through 1971, the use of defoliants, and you see the planes spraying the defoliant on the jungle. And then you can see the picture at the bottom where the jungle's just simply gone. It kills the plant life, and it's hard for, and the idea is the Viet Cong can't hide when there's no cover. And if you eliminate all the cover, well, Vietnam's a damn big country, and there's a whole lot of jungle. And with a whole lot of jungle, it took a whole lot of defoliant. And they sprayed this over combat troops. They sprayed this on ground that combat troops would go into. They sprayed it on villages. And this stuff is highly toxic, especially Agent Orange. And it led to veterans after the Vietnam War having all kinds of health problems, especially cancer, related to the use of Agent Orange. And then the environmental catastrophe of the use of Agent Orange was on a catastrophic scale. This is just one picture in the upper left-hand corner, one picture of a depot with empty 55-gallon drums. But there were places in the Philippines and Thailand and that there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of empty, contaminated 55-gallon drums that had contained Agent Orange. Now, with the complaint of the troops that they were unprotected for the use of Agent Orange, and by the way, Agent Orange could not only be sprayed by the airplanes, but soldiers on the ground could put Agent Orange in containers and spray it around their outposts to prevent the jungle from encroaching on encampments. Rivercraft often loaded drums of Agent Orange and used it in their flamethrower, but instead of projecting flame, they projected defoliant. It was used by the Navy, it was used by the Air Force, it was sprayed from helicopters, it was dumped from helicopters, and even one group began using Smokey the Bear. You know, only you can prevent forest fires, but they changed the logo to only you can prevent a forest. But once Agent Orange ran out, they resorted to other defoliants which weren't as effective, but they also weren't as damaging to the troops using them. Agent White and Agent Blue. Kind of like a sick box of crayons. Agent Orange, Agent White, and Agent Blue. But in the Americanization of the war, we're not only going to bring our mechanical expertise, it's not only going to be Americans more involved in the program, we're also using technology, we think, to our advantage. Throughout Vietnam, and we're not going to list all the battles, and this is one of the problems I have in teaching Vietnam, especially in a survey class. It's such a long war, And there aren't a lot of set-piece battles. The few battles that we fight, we win. We win in head-to-head battles between our army and the Army of North Vietnam. We win, and we win every time. The mobility of the U.S. Army with the helicopters, the technological advantage the U.S. had, certainly allowed, and you can see in the Battle of Idrang Valley, the use of the various helicopters and the mobility to hit multiple landing sites to envelop the NVA, cut them off from retreat. We were highly successful in that. Unfortunately, the Vietnamese the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam didn't always play the game we desired for them to play. And so quite often, they just simply avoided a set-piece battle and maneuvered into the jungle and forced small American units to go into the jungle to find them or to rely on technology. And so the part of the Americanization of the war is the mechanization of the war. And so not only the use of helicopters, which you see there, the use of flamethrowers, and you see the river craft shooting flames from all sides as it sets the jungle on fire to drive out enemy guerrillas. And then the use of jellied petroleum, napalm, in the upper left. All of that to interdict an enemy that fades away in the jungle, and rather than go in and pursue them every time, you just simply use the technology at your disposal. In fact, one of those myths that grow up about Vietnam is American leaders counted actual bodies, and there would be an actual body count of enemy soldiers killed, and then there would be a second tally of, because, you know, a petroleum bomb doesn't leave much for you to count. And so they would have an estimated body count of enemy troops killed. But in fact, records now show, as we've established a closer relationship with Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union, we now know we were more effective than we even estimated in the attacks on the NVA and the Viet Cong. We were highly successful. Leftists don't want us to believe that. The leftists of the new left, the protesters of the 60s, who are now in positions of leadership and in positions of academia today, they don't want us to claim victory in Vietnam. But we were winning the ground war by all estimations. The problem is we're facing an unconventional foe. And so along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where most of these pictures were taken, you have peasants using bicycles as pack mules, simply carrying supplies on their back in traditional ways that they've been using for centuries, and it's extremely hard to counter that. But by all measurable statistic, the United States was winning in Vietnam through 66, 67, 68. So the Americanization of the war, of course, was effective. By the end of 1965, there were 180,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. So by the end of 1965, 180,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. In 1966, that number roughly doubled to 360,000 American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1967, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And so while we reach 500,000 American servicemen and women in Vietnam, and that's mostly in South Vietnam, very few incursions into North Vietnam. And of course, patrols would cross into Laos and Cambodia because that's where the enemy took refuge. And so whether legally or illegally, they would follow the Viet Cong across the border into Laos and Cambodia. And so there would be excursions, and then later the war will be expanded to Laos and Cambodia in an attempt to drive the communists to the peace tables. But as the war progressed and the Americanization of the war progressed, Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Fiery Dart, and then Linebacker 1 and 2 began dropping the tonnage on Vietnam. There would be reports in the newspaper the United States had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than had been dropped in World War I. Then there were more bombs dropped in Vietnam than had been dropped in World War II. Then there was a statistic that said the United States had dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than it had dropped in World War I, World War II, and Korea combined. And then it was the United States dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than had been dropped in the history of the world to that point. In fact, one of the statistics is that in World War II, the United States dropped 2,057,244 tons of bombs during that global conflict. Kind of wonder who counts that. Is there some office in the Defense Department and the War Department before it, some bean counter that's got an abacus, and every time the report comes in of a bomb being dropped, they're calculating as to total tonnage? That job would stink. But estimated almost 2.1 million tons of bombs dropped in World War II. In Vietnam, the United States dropped 7,078,032 tons of bombs, or, if you prefer, 1,000 pounds of bombs for every man, woman, and child in Vietnam. And of course, more soldiers in Vietnam, more air sorties over North Vietnam, more raids across Southeast Asia means more casualties. By the spring of 1966, there were more than 4,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. But by the end of 1965, there was a reasonably stable government in South Vietnam under General Nguyen Van Tho, which was hardly less brutal than Diem had been. But Johnson thought he could work with Tho, and so even though Tho was hardly less brutal or less corrupt than Diem had been, the United States could work with him. The government seemed to be in good hands. The war seemed to be going well, even though the Viet Cong controlled a majority of villages and hamlets throughout South Vietnam. The United States controlled most of the major cities, and that becomes part of this conflict. What is surprising to people is at the end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies controlled 80% of South Vietnam. They actually controlled a majority of the country, and it was stable. But the United States got bogged down in a quagmire, the term generally used for the Vietnam War, a quagmire, beginning in 1966, in which they couldn't seem to win, but they weren't losing. They couldn't drive the communists to the peace tables, but nor could they fully win the conflict and bring about a forced solution on North Vietnam. And so this led to a heavy-handed style of technological warfare that grinds both you and your enemy down. Beginning in 1966, with the Americanization of the war in full force, and the Department of Defense reporting a favorable kill ratio. Optimistic reports began pouring into the American people via radio, via TV, that America was winning the Vietnam War. Then in the beginnings of 1968, the year that changed everything, January 1968, countrywide, and every red dot on there is a U.S. military base, air base, our presence. In every major population center from the 17th parallel to the southern tip of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the NLF hit every major position. It was called the Tet Offensive to celebrate the Chinese New Year of Tet. And it had 3 phases. The first phase is what you see on the board, but lasting throughout 68, January 30th through March 28th, hitting and taking many of those population centers. The simple truth about Tet is, though, while it did look impressive on TV, and that's the key. While it looked impressive on TV and men like Walter Cronkite began talking down the conflict, began turning against American involvement, the simple fact is North Vietnam threw everything they had, and within days, all of those positions were retaken, and the North Vietnamese army lost the cream of its ability. The Tet Offensive, while initially successful, and it made good copy, simply almost broke the back of the North Vietnamese war effort. And if not for the dogged determination of the Soviets and the Chinese to keep the North Vietnamese in the conflict, the war would have been over in 68. But with the Tet Offensive, American protests develop in earnest. Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election. And as we've already talked about, his Democratic successors, those who want his job, all run as opposing Vietnam and the Vietnam War. It's Richard Nixon and his victory in November of 68. And you can see an early meeting between Nixon. Nixon is just in this picture. Nixon has just become the Republican nominee. And part of the agreement between the parties is that the nominee for the opposition party can meet with officials in the sitting party and be brought up to speed on events. So as they go out on the campaign trail, the party in power doesn't have an unfair advantage. And so Nixon is talking with LBJ, but the media, especially musicians, student protests, all turn against the war. But Nixon runs on a platform in November of 68 that the war is still winnable, and he promises a peace with victory. And in fact, Nixon delivers on that promise. And this is the nasty little secret about Vietnam. Nixon, who is often seen as the warmonger, didn't escalate the war, he de-escalated it. Troops begin coming home under Richard Nixon. He begins pulling American soldiers out of the conflict. In fact, in the fall of 1969, remember he takes office January of 69, so as he gets his feet under him, he announces a new policy for the United States called the Vietnamization of the war, which means turning the war back over to the South Vietnamese, putting them back in positions to defend their own country. And so he's de-escalating the conflict, Vietnamizing the conflict, but also he decides that it's not fair that the North Vietnamese and the Russians and the Chinese involved in North Vietnam, by the way, there were plenty of Soviet and Chinese troops in North Vietnam and in South Vietnam participating with North Vietnamese troops, that they could take refuge in Laos and Cambodia. And so Nixon expands the war to Laos and Cambodia so that they couldn't take refuge. And he begins returning American troops. So Nixon announces in the fall of '69 the withdrawal of the first American troops from Vietnam. 60,000 American troops come home. The first reduction in force since Eisenhower. And over the course of the next 3 years, Nixon continues to withdraw and increase the number coming home, so that by the fall of 1972, there are in fact very few American soldiers still in Vietnam. So as Nixon begins the withdrawals, U.S. involvement in Vietnam had reached its peak. So even though it's under Nixon in 1969, it's still troops that Johnson had sent before he left office. So by the time Nixon begins withdrawing troops, American involvement had reached its height at 540,000 troops in Vietnam. By 1972, there were only 60,000 left in Vietnam. Now, you wouldn't know that from the war protests. Why? Because the left had been fully infiltrated by communist agents. Now, and I'm not blanket painting the anti-war movement and saying they were all communist. That's simply not true. There are some who just simply didn't agree with the war effort, didn't believe the Johnson administration in its reasons for fighting the war, didn't agree with containment, but most of the anti-war movements got at least ideological support from the isolationists of World War II. They borrow from their literature. They borrow from the anti-imperialist literature of a previous age. And certainly they use the anti-colonial literature of the supposed communist liberators. And all through North Vietnamese anti-colonial writings, and you even hear this today, that the Americas are a colonial power and anti-colonialism. Well, in fact, that's exactly what the communists were doing. They were trying to create a loyal Vietnam that was their puppet regime. They were just as colonial, communists were just as colonial as the capitalists of the West. But the war protest in the various forms reached its peak in 1972. So even as Nixon is de-escalating the war, as he's turning it over to the Vietnamese for them to fight for their own independence, he's being attacked as a warmonger. He's being accused of the one who got us into the war, when nothing could be further from the truth. And then, of course, a number of die-ins. That's what you see, the picture in the middle. Die-ins, where students laid on the steps of university campi or government buildings and pretended to be dead to protest the war. And you see street protests. You see protests at the Washington Mall. And then you see protests that get out of hand, like Kent State, where the National Guard actually opens fire on protesters. And of course, any president that's in power when something of that, a travesty, a disaster of that magnitude occurs, you're going to be painted with a dark brush. And that's certainly what happens to Nixon. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of Nixon, but Nixon has been vilified for the Vietnam War wrongly. And in fact, Nixon did withhold information from Congress and from the American public about his expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos. But he also didn't want to escalate communist involvement and create a crisis when he was trying to do exactly the opposite, force the communists to the peace table. And in fact, it did work. Congress would repeal, in December of 1970, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. December of 1970, repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. But Nixon claimed that he had authority to continue military involvement in Vietnam and to protect American troops already there. And so while the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution may have been voided, he still continued the war effort. Congress then passed the War Powers Act. By the way, despite what your book says, every president that has followed Nixon has declared the War Powers Act was unconstitutional. That the president's power to declare war is absolute. And the president can, as commander-in-chief, can involve the United States in a conflict, but is not necessarily obligated for a report to Congress and to withdraw on a congressional timeline. Either way, in 1972 is an election year, and President Nixon is running for re-election. Unfortunately for Nixon, he's running for re-election because involved in this, and we'll talk about this in the next video, Nixon becomes involved in spying on the Democratic Party to see what dirty tricks they were up to, and we'll talk about this later. But in the 1972 campaign, it was leaked from someone, and probably purposefully leaked, that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had been in secret negotiations with North Vietnam. And in October 26, 1972, Kissinger announced, "Peace is at hand." But then shortly after the election, and Nixon wins an overwhelming victory, shortly after the election, December 16, 1972, the peace talks broke down. And so the next day, American B-52s began 12 days of around-the-clock bombing of North Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese decided to return to the peace tables. On January 27, 1973, representatives from the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong all signed, and I quote, "an agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam." There would be an immediate ceasefire, and the North Vietnamese would release American prisoners of war held in their hands. And by the way, they didn't follow up on this. They would release most of the American POWs, but even into the 80s and 90s, there's still reports of American GIs being illegally held in Vietnam. Everything from crops that had been harvested in such a way as to write out dog tag numbers that could be read by satellites, numbers scuffed in the dirt, as American labor was used in Vietnam as prison labor, very much like the Soviet Union had done to the Nazis in Siberia after World War II. But most of the prisoners were returned with the ceasefire, and the United States began the withdrawal of the rest of its troops. Nixon proclaimed peace with honor. And so I ask you, was it a peace with honor? Well, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, South Vietnam, the United States all recognized the existence of South Vietnam. And when the United States pulls out its last troops in 1973, South Vietnam was a stable, flourishing country. In fact, rice production in South Vietnam outstripped anything approaching rice production in North Vietnam. By all intents and purposes in 73, it looks like the United States has, in fact, won. Now, we look back on Vietnam and we say, but obviously we lost because South Vietnam collapses. Well, that wasn't the fault of Nixon in 73. Because of student protests, because of student pressure, because of pressure from Congress, because of the American people wanting an end to the conflict, he brought the communists to the peace table and got them to sign a peace acknowledging South Vietnam and allowing the United States to withdraw. The simple fact is, North Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and Communist China simply never even intended to live up to the peace agreement. North Vietnamese army forces never withdrew from South Vietnam. The Viet Cong continued subversive activities against South Vietnam. And so by the Paris Accords in 73, the United States withdraws. In March of 1975, North Vietnam launched an all-out attack against South Vietnam. Then President Gerald Ford, Nixon having resigned over the Watergate scandal, then President Gerald Ford had President of South Vietnam, General Tho, request help. President Ford went to Congress and asked for the authority to send American troops, American planes, back into Vietnam to save our ally. And the simple fact is, Congress had taken a hard turn left. The Democrats had won decisive control of Congress, and Congress said no. And Ford didn't have Ford being a non-elected president, didn't have the funding, he didn't have the capabilities to send troops back into Vietnam, and so he was forced to take a bite of the excrement sandwich that was the collapse of South Vietnam. Americans watched with horror. And I still remember, I was 7 years old. I still remember seeing this on TV and how shook up my parents were watching on the nightly news as Walter Cronkite reported the evacuation of American embassy personnel climbing aboard the helicopters and being flown to aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin and in the South China Sea. Watching as cameras rolled as the American embassy fell, and the horror of our allies, those Vietnamese that have been loyal to the United States over the past 11 years, evacuating to ships and then being brought to the United States. So in 1975, South Vietnamese government fled, as did the staff of the U.S. Embassy, and Saigon fell to communist forces, who promptly renamed it, in a middle finger to the United States, renamed it Ho Chi Minh City, and began the process of reuniting the country under Hanoi's rule. Now, Ho Chi Minh himself died years before, but just as he had done in North Vietnam, where he purged the populace of North Vietnam, killing off the opposition, killing hundreds of thousands of his own people, so too in South Vietnam began the process of the communists eliminating those who had sympathized with the United States. Across the border in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian equivalent to the Viet Cong, began to undermine the authority of Lon Nol, the leader of Cambodia, bringing Pol Pot to power. and in a savage reign of terror unparalleled in world history. 1/3 of Cambodia's population died either from extermination by Pol Pot, by starvation, or by simple exhaustion. But the United States didn't care. We were out of the war. We were withdrawn from Southeast Asia. We had our own problems to worry about, such as what was going to be on TV tonight. And so Vietnam falls to the communists. Containment, that first domino of containment falls, and it remains to be seen how the communists will exploit South Vietnam going communist. But that's the subject of future videos.